I'm Annie Fitzsimmons. I'm your Washington REALTORS Legal Hotline lawyer. And there is a bit of confusion that I see from time to time, and I think we need to clarify it. Broker is representing buyer in the transaction, and it could be equally true for the listing broker, but I see it more often, at least originate with a buyer. Buyer's done their inspection under Form 35, the inspection contingency, and the buyer is ready to ask for concessions. Here's the question. Does it matter which form the buyer broker uses? Does the buyer broker have to use Form 35R? Or could the buyer broker just use Form 34? Because there's a lot more space. Form 35R is really constrained from a space perspective because there's just a few lines for the buyer, and then there's a few lines, even fewer lines really, for the seller. And so more often than not, it feels like we overflow onto a Form 34 anyway. What's the harm in just jettisoning the Form 35R from the beginning and going straight to a Form 34? Well, brokers, remember that when you draft a purchase and sale agreement or any component of a purchase and sale agreement, you are held to the standard of care of a lawyer. And it's not that you're not allowed to use a Form 34 to draft the buyer's request for concessions or even the seller's response, but it matters which form you use, and you're held to the standard of care not only when you draft language, but even when you select the form to use. So what's the difference in a Form 34 and a Form 35R? Form 34 is a blank addendum. An addendum is a document that adds, an addendum, and it adds terms to an existing agreement, to an existing contract. Nothing specific about the type of terms. There's no parameters around the terms or negotiations or anything else. An addendum simply means that this is a piece of paper that adds terms to the purchase and sale agreement. That's what Form 34 does. Form 35R has language in it that says, it ties into the Form 35 inspection contingency so that when a buyer uses Form 35R, that first section of Form 35R dedicated to buyer's use, the fourth checkbox provision in that section, they mark that box and then they ask seller to make concessions identified on those few lines that are there. When the buyer uses that form, the boilerplate language triggers aspects of the buyer's inspection contingency addendum that does a couple of things. It says that if the seller agrees to all of the concessions that buyer is seeking, that satisfies buyer's inspection contingency, and the parties are now moving to closing. It also says that when the buyer requests concessions under their inspection contingency, and they deliver that request, that automatically triggers a 3-day response period for the seller, which then leads to a 3-day reply period for the buyer. So what if we use Form 34 instead of Form 35R? Let's look at that first issue. Remember I said that using the Form 35R ties into the inspection contingency so that when seller agrees to make the concessions buyer has asked for, buyer's inspection contingency is satisfied. But if you don't use Form 35R, buyer brokers and listing brokers, because this affects the sellers, listing broker, if you get a buyer's request for concessions under an inspection contingency, but the request for concessions is written on a Form 34 only, and your seller agrees. Buyer says, lower the price by $5,000, and seller says, done. They sign the Form 34. Nothing about that Form 34 is tied to buyer's inspection contingency, which means buyer has not satisfied their inspection contingency, through seller's agreement to the request that was made, which means that buyer still has their inspection contingency. So unless the time has already run out, but let's say it hasn't, let's say it was a 10-day inspection contingency and it's on day 7 that buyer delivers the Form 34 saying, hey, let's lower the price by $5,000, and seller says done, signs it. Then, as a matter of contract, buyer still has 3 days left in their inspection contingency. So when buyer comes back a day later and says, and I want seller to replace the roof, and seller says, wait a sec, we already went through this. I agreed to lower the price by $5,000. We're done. No, I still have an inspection contingency, buyer could say. And now you replace the roof, or I'm terminating the contract. That was not what seller expected, because that was not what listing broker expected, because listing broker misunderstood the use of Form 34 to replace the use of Form 35R. In other words, viewed them as interchangeable, and they're not. Because using Form 34 in that context did not satisfy buyer's inspection contingency. Seller was, for lack of a better word, duped. What about this? Let's put the shoe on the other foot. Buyer broker delivers that same addendum, but they don't deliver it on day 7 of a 10-day inspection contingency. They deliver it on day 10. They deliver it at 8:30 p.m. on day 10, and they deliver a Form 34 that says, seller, lower the price by $5,000. And then the next day gets here. So buyer's initial 10-day inspection period ended at 9 p.m. the day before, 30 minutes after buyer broker delivered that Form 34 saying lower the price by $5,000. And buyer's thinking, now I've got 3 days for seller to decide what they want to do. But if you've been paying attention and you can anticipate where this video is going, then you know that in reality, use of that Form 34 did not trigger the negotiation parameters outlined in Form 35. Buyer does not have 3 more days in their inspection contingency for seller's negotiation period. Instead, buyer's inspection contingency expired at 9 p.m. the night before because buyer broker used the wrong form. Buyer broker failed to select the form that should have been selected had the broker risen to the standard of care of a lawyer in the selection and completion of those forms. It's a big deal, brokers. Which form you use has consequences. Before we conclude this video, let me tell you the way that you should incorporate use of both Form 35R and Form 34 when your concern is that there's not sufficient space on Form 35R to say everything you need to say. There is a way to handle this. You use your Form 35R, you mark the correct box, and then you write on those blank lines, you write, see attached Form 34. And with that, you've got the advantage of all the boilerplate language that triggers or ties back to the inspection contingency addendum, and you create more space for you to write the terms that are important to your client. Always use that Form 35R first because you need the boilerplate language from Form 35R. And if you also need a Form 34 to fully explain what it is your client is trying to accomplish, then say on the Form 35R, write see Form 34, and then write those terms on the Form 34. And those 2 forms should be attached. If you're physically delivering them, they could be stapled. That's not typically how you deliver them. So you would deliver them as part of the same PDF in an email going back to the other client, to the other broker, the other party in the transaction. If you have questions on this topic or any other, please visit warealtor.org. Follow the links to the Legal Hotline and ask me a question. Thank you for being a Washington REALTORS member.